Welcome back to today's commentary. What would you think if I told you the European Union is considering lowering its own economic growth targets just to continue fueling a war that's rapidly approaching a dead end? Would you consider that madness or tragedy? Lowering GDP means sacrificing jobs, social security, and the livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people, all to keep supplying funds and weapons to Ukraine. Even more alarming, Western leaders are fully aware they have no way out other than to keep sacrificing their own people rather than admit a strategic failure in their anti-Russia agenda. Right now, in a tense behind-the-scenes discussion, a Western official admitted to the press, "We were wrong. Putin isn't collapsing. He's reclaiming territory at a rate that's shocking NATO military circles. A NATO standard fortress just fell after 4 years of continuous support. Inside Ukraine, a cold reality is spreading. Failure isn't coming. It has already begun." But that's just the tip of the iceberg. What's really happening is a silent power transition between international powers, where the US-led unipolar world risks officially ending and a new door is opening, emerging from the battlefields of Ukraine. Why does Russia dare to confront NATO? How can Putin maintain record approval ratings amidst encirclement? And what makes even Western media admit that the plan to destroy Russia has failed? The answers will gradually unfold in the frames ahead. And I guarantee that after watching this video, you'll never look at Ukraine, NATO, and Russia the same way again. Europe is fighting against Russia, but who is really benefiting? It's thought to be a war for justice, for democracy, but as the fog of slogans clears, the truth is coming into focus. Behind the expressions of solidarity with Ukraine are soaring energy bills, massive military aid packages drawn from social security budgets, and a harsh reality: Europeans are tightening their belts while the US sells liquefied gas at exorbitant prices. Without cheap energy from Russia, European nations are forced to buy it from the US at many times the cost. Each cubic meter of gas is exchanged for dollars, for economic stability, and for the trust of the people. But what is more shocking is that the EU leaders have discussed the extreme measure of lowering the entire bloc's GDP growth to divert funds to aid Ukraine. They are considering reducing the GDP of member states to finance aid to Ukraine. You heard right. They're planning to reduce economic development, sacrificing the living standards of millions to sustain a war whose end they can't foresee. And the bitter truth is that this isn't Europe's war. It's a strategic game for the US. While Washington applauds, European countries struggle to pay for everything from military expenses and soldier salaries to financing the operation of an entire Ukrainian government. Yes, an entire government operates amidst bombs funded by EU citizens. Every tank, every missile, every Ukrainian soldier's salary is secretly printed on the tax bills of the French, Germans, and Italians. But do the people agree? Widespread dissatisfaction and simmering protests have begun in Berlin and Paris, and ironically, the more they protest, the more they're labeled as pro-Russian. So where is the US in all this? The US loses nothing but a few tens of billions of dollars in exchange for the gas market, for the role of Big Brother in NATO, and especially for pushing Europe into dependence, making it inseparable. This has led many analysts to exclaim that the EU has put a magic ring on its own head, and the one tightening it is none other than the US. The picture becomes clearer when we see that Ukraine, that battlefield, is becoming the excuse for the US to drain Europe's defense budgets, forcing them to increase defense spending and buy more American-made weapons, killing many birds with one stone, controlling the political, economic, and military aspects of all of Europe. Yet, Russia hasn't retreated. On the contrary, Russia has stood firm after more than 4 years of being surrounded, sanctioned, and threatened, and that has caused the West's entire initial strategy to collapse. The game has been revealed, but Europe still refuses to withdraw. So, the question is, how long until the people of Europe are angry enough to say, "This isn't our war"? And will they dare to cut that magic ring before it suffocates every last hope? Can Zelensky still control the war? 5 years after the first shots were fired, Ukraine is no longer a nation entering war with confidence. Now, it's a broken, disoriented body and a president teetering in the quagmire he created. Volodymyr Zelensky once was the perfect media figure, a young, decisive president who spoke fluent English and was praised by the West as a symbol of democracy. But that aura can't hide the reality on the battlefield. The Ukrainian armed forces are gradually declining in manpower, logistics, ammunition, and morale. Russia's strong blows in the east and northeast have cost Ukraine its most important defenses, and Zelensky is doing the only thing he can, begging for aid. After a corruption scandal shook his administration, Zelensky flew to Paris, signing a contract to buy 100 French fighters, 100 combat aircraft. It sounds impressive, but then people realized there was nothing concrete. No delivery date, no progress, no firm financial commitment or details, making observers laugh. Pilots are still being trained, the planes don't exist, and the pilots aren't ready. So what is that agreement? It's PR, it's symbolic, it's something for Zelensky to put in front of the camera and tell his people that the West still stands behind Ukraine. But the people are no longer so easily fooled because they're living the reality. Power outages, water shortages, rising prices, and more young men being drafted into the army in vain. Retreating convoys, abandoned strongholds. These are the images that news outlets don't want to broadcast. But every Ukrainian soldier understands the war is slipping from their hands. Zelensky doesn't say that. He still speaks out every week, asking for more aid, more ammunition, more missiles. But he doesn't talk about the dwindling belief, about how even the West is now reluctantly trying to delay each round of aid because they know that pumping in more only prolongs the agony, but doesn't change the outcome. Ukraine used to be called a democratic outpost. Now it's a living testament to a nation pushed to the front lines, but with nothing behind it. And Zelensky, still wearing his military uniform, still holding a microphone, is gradually becoming a burnt-out puppet, unable to control his own country and unable to escape the role he once accepted with all his faith. But faith can't fight reality. The question is, how long can he hold on when the fuse is lit, but the game continues? When a nation chooses to move its army out of its borders, there are two possibilities: either to expand influence or for self-defense. For Russia, it's not a choice, it's destiny. Over the past 4 years, thousands of Russian soldiers have fallen. But that's not the price for a military adventure. It's the trade-off for Russia not to succumb, because as President Putin once stated, if Russia yields, it means admitting defeat, and the nation's fate will no longer be in the hands of the Russian people. Therefore, the special military operation in Ukraine isn't a gamble. It's a wake-up call when NATO approaches the border, when Ukraine is increasingly tied to the Western military structure, and when Russia's national security is threatened at its doorstep. Many in the West thought Russia would back down, that the pressure of sanctions, isolation, and punishment would weaken the Kremlin. But what has happened to date proves the opposite. Russia not only stands firm, but also counterattacks strongly, and remarkably, the people support it. In the most recent election amidst intense conflict, Putin received the highest approval rating in modern Russian history. Not because the people don't know the war is fierce, but because they understand that no one can protect Russia but themselves. Also, negotiations, if they were possible, are in the past. In the first year, there might still have been a chance, but now, after thousands of casualties, after so many ruined cities, there's no reason for Russia to retreat. Giving in is no longer goodwill, but admitting that all sacrifices were meaningless. As the West tries to redraw the map of influence, Russia chooses to stand tall, not just with weapons, but with will. They understand that once the right to decide security falls into the hands of others, once the border is approached by a sworn enemy, sovereignty is just a formality. And in this war, Russia isn't fighting for new territory. Russia is fighting to protect what has belonged to it for hundreds of years, the right to exist as an independent power, not subdued by pressure from anyone. One can argue about strategy, losses, or geopolitics, but one thing is undeniable. For Russia, this is no longer a choice between victory or defeat, but between existence and being swallowed. That's why they don't stop. No one can order the Russians to give up. Not the US, not NATO, because when the homeland is threatened, retreat is the most unaffordable luxury. And if anyone still hopes that they can force Russia to its knees with sanctions or encirclement tactics, perhaps they have never understood what makes a nation invincible. Something is quietly happening that few notice, but its consequences will shape the coming century. The unipolar world, where the US once was the global policeman, is breaking apart, and the ashes from the conflict in Ukraine are fertilizing the seeds for a new multipolar order that is rising. Before, just a press conference in the White House was enough for the world to listen intently. A ban, a statement on democracy, was enough for small nations to adjust their policies. But now, it's different. Calls to protect freedom, support human rights from Washington now sound like an old song that few want to hear. China remains silent. India keeps its distance. ASEAN nations choose neutrality. And a world once dominated by the dollar is now starting to trade in yuan, in rupees, in bilateral agreements without intermediaries. They don't stand with Russia, but they don't stand with the US either. They stand with themselves. And that's what confuses the West. Because for so long, they have been used to a world with only two colors, support or opposition. Now, it's no longer the case. The world has learned to refuse to line up, and Ukraine is the stage where that refusal is most visible. When the US and the EU continuously introduced sanctions, hoping to draw the world into isolating Russia, they thought there would be a wave of response, but the result was a wave of silence. Not consensus, but neglect. No one loudly opposes, but no one complies. Because everyone understands that if it's Russia today, it could be them tomorrow. The war in Ukraine, though fierce and brutal, unintentionally became a mirror, reflecting the truth that not everyone who speaks of democracy is defending democracy, that not everyone who carries the name of freedom has the right to impose it, and that not every nation is willing to be dragged into a game that isn't beneficial to them. This is the time when the world no longer belongs to one faction, one axis, one power, but when nations begin to step out of the long-standing shadow to say, we want to choose our own path. And that's what Russia understands best. Not needing to force anyone to its side, but being steadfast enough to show the world that a nation can exist, grow, and hold its head high without kneeling before any superpower. Since the war in Ukraine erupted, NATO has continuously poured troops, weapons, and defense systems to its eastern flank. They call it a defensive shield, a democratic fortress. But the question is, who is that fortress protecting, and who is it really threatening? Russia has warned more than once that when you attack, everything will burn. A statement that sounds aggressive, but looking back at Russia's history of confrontation, one knows it's not a threat, it's a red line. Yet the West mistook silence for weakness. They continued to concentrate forces in the east, placing missiles, building bases, and conducting exercises close to the border. They believed that doing so would make Russia afraid. But what they didn't anticipate is that the tighter they tightened the encirclement, the more they put themselves in a position to be encircled in reverse. Many military experts have warned that NATO's eastern flank, from Poland, Romania to the Baltic states, would be the first to take a hit if war broke out. They would become the front line, not for their own war, but for America's decades-long dream of isolating and breaking Russia. Ironically, these nations are becoming experimental pawns. The shield they erect is now reflecting their own powerlessness. They increase military presence but lack a long-term defense strategy. They chase after power but forget the element of survival. The map of war is not just the position of the army, but also the psychology of an entire nation facing the risk of becoming a battlefield. They build fortresses with huge defense budgets, but neglect logistical preparation and civil defense. And in the scenario of widespread war, what is called the eastern flank would no longer be a protective belt, but the first line to be incinerated. Russia understands that, and they aren't in a hurry. Because, as has happened in history, Russia is never the one to start a war, but always the one to end it with irreversible blows. The West thinks they are holding a knife in front of the Russian bear, but perhaps they forget that a bear, when cornered, doesn't need a knife. Just one swipe is enough to reverse the entire game. And then, what they call a shield will become the first target. As America is in turmoil and the war in Ukraine is increasingly out of control, Donald Trump unexpectedly returns with a 28-point peace plan. Western media calls him the awakened emperor, but, looking closely, one can see that it's not a plan carrying hope, but an agreement for the US to save face. In those 28 points, there's no commitment to withdraw troops, no demilitarization of Ukraine, and no clause guaranteeing real security for Russia. All are superficial concessions, reducing Ukrainian troop numbers to 600,000, not allowing Ukraine to join NATO, but still leaving open the option for the West to provide military support. Those clauses, if put on the negotiating table, are no different from a message. Russia, stop, and everything will remain as is. But for Russia, especially for Putin, the years of bloodshed aren't to exchange for a commitment of goodwill from an American politician campaigning for election. Putin understands better than anyone that Russia entered this war not to negotiate, but to erase an imposed game. And if thousands of lives have been sacrificed to break the old unipolar order, there's no reason for them to stop just because of a formal agreement. Trump knows that it's unlikely Russia will accept, but he needs something else, an image of a president willing to offer a peaceful solution to win voters, a plan to say later that he offered an option, but they refused. And that's the fatal weakness of the West. They always think everything can be solved with PR. They forget that for Russia, face isn't in a speech but in every meter of land retained, every decision not to yield. Trump wants to trade with reputation, but Putin doesn't need to win. He needs a future where Russia isn't controlled by anyone, a new order where the West is no longer the imposer. And that's why those 28 points, no matter how polished, are just echoes in the void. Russia doesn't need the hand of peace from someone who once called them an enemy. They just need to stand firm, and they are achieving that. For 4 years, the US and Europe have focused their efforts, funds, and entire media system on one goal: to make Russia collapse from within. They thought that with enough sanctions, enough isolation, enough pressure, the Russian people would turn their backs on their president. But now, a senior US official has had to admit that the plan to overthrow Putin has failed. And not just failed, but failed miserably. Because amidst the fierce war, amidst hundreds of thousands of distorted news items, amidst countless economic difficulties, Putin still receives the highest approval rating in modern Russian history. Meanwhile, on the other side of the battlefield, Western leaders from the US, Germany, to France are struggling to keep their approval ratings above 30%. The question is, why do the Russian people continue to trust? The answer is clear: because they see a leader who doesn't retreat, who isn't subdued, who doesn't bargain the nation's fate before the international chessboard. And the clearer they see that, the more desperate the Ukrainians become. Once praised as a democratic front line, Ukraine is now falling freely on the battlefield, with no support, no strategy, and no firm promises from anyone. The West isn't helping Ukraine win. They're only helping Ukraine prolong its defeat. The EU has never had a clear plan to bring Ukraine to victory. All are slogans, commitments, small aid packages, as if saving a ship with a hole in its bottom. And as Ukraine gradually loses cities, loses troops, loses morale, the West starts talking about negotiation, about political solutions, about the path to peace. Those words are appropriate. Here's a refined and expanded translation of the provided text, tailored for an American audience, focusing on clarity and impactful delivery. The realization that Ukraine was set up should have dawned in the very first year, not after tens of thousands of Ukrainians had already fallen. Now, Zelensky is no longer a symbol of resilience. He's become a political liability, an exposed card with no further value. Ukraine was thrust into this conflict by those who never genuinely intended for them to prevail. As the strategic chessboard shifts and the advantage tilts toward Russia, Ukraine finds itself abandoned on the battlefield by its very allies, the same ones who initially fueled the conflict. This isn't merely a defeat for Kyiv, it's a stark exposure of a flawed strategy from the outset, a miscalculated gamble by the US and Europe, and the price they may not be able to afford. The war in Ukraine ceased being solely about Ukraine long ago. It's now the last stand for a dying world order, a unipolar system where the US dictates the rules and other nations are left with a binary choice: submit or confront. Ironically, while Washington and Brussels believe they were cornering Russia, they are, in fact, the ones faltering. From political credibility to tangible economic realities, everything is eroding daily due to a war with no discernible exit. They wagered on Russia's collapse, but it's the West that's bearing the brunt of the consequences. The dollar is losing its symbolic dominance as numerous countries turn away. Energy markets are being manipulated in reverse, and the concept of Western soft power is now a hollow shell, exposed by global citizens who witness the ridiculous disparity between rhetoric and reality. And Ukraine, once promised to be a beacon of democracy, is now merely the ashes of unfulfilled promises, a nation dragged into a war on behalf of others, only to be abandoned precisely when it needs rescuing the most. It's a tragically laughable example. The US and Europe are reportedly considering sending 25 of their most advanced air defense systems to Ukraine, an action heralded by the media as a game-changing solution. However, in the current context, anyone understands that these 25 systems, if deployed, could be destroyed in a mere week. This 7-day estimate isn't just a pessimistic hunch, it's a reality confirmed by repeated failures against Russian UAV and long-range guided missile strikes. These multi-million-dollar systems are proving more fragile than ever against Russia's battlefield technology. And that is also the moment when the whole world has to admit that the unipolar world is over. No longer does a single power center exist that can control everything. No longer does a single voice speak for global will. A multipolar world is taking shape, slowly but surely. For Vietnam, a nation that has never succumbed to any empire, this is a time that requires more vigilance than ever before. Neutrality isn't about standing aside. It's about knowing where to stand to avoid becoming a pawn for any power while preserving one's voice, sovereignty, and identity. If you sense that the world is changing and want to see it from a different, fairer, and less propagandistic perspective, then share this video. Someone else might need to hear what you just heard. And sometimes, a simple truth is the most powerful thing of all.